without further ado, I want to introduce Christian McBurney. He's the author and co-author of 9 books on Rhode Island history. He's a publisher and chief editor of the Review of Rhode Island History at smallstatebighistory.com, devoted to Rhode Island history. He practices law in Washington, D.C., and he and his wife have a second home in West Kingston, Rhode Island, to discuss machine guns in Narragansett Bay. Christian, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very nice to be here. Can everyone hear me okay in the back? Fred? Good. Abe Lincoln was known as a very light speaker, and he was at Cooper Union. He had a friend visiting from Illinois. He was speaking in New York City. It was the biggest speech he ever gave. And so he had the friend stand in the back, and he was going to raise a poster if he wasn't loud enough, but he never had to, so that was good. As you mentioned, I'm the publisher of Small State Big History. How many of you get my weekly emails? Oh, very high percentage. I'd say 50%. So if you're interested in receiving them, I send out an email once a week. It has an article on Rhode Island history. Some are by me. I have many co-authors. I wish Jim would be a co-author. Sounds like a very good topic, the one you're going to speak about. If you're interested, sign up. I have 2,700 people on the email list, so a lot of Rhode Island history lovers. And you can see it. I've got over 400 articles on the site, so you could go back and look at all the archives. And I'll send around this site. I'm sorry I don't have a clipboard. I always forget. My dog actually did eat this, but I think it'd still work. Do be careful putting down your email address, but if you could just pass it around. Whoops, I'm not going that side. There we go. Good idea, Jim. And also, I do have some books here. As I mentioned, I have a lot in Rhode Island history. Got the Rhode Island Campaign book, which I've spoken about here. It includes the most authoritative description of the Battle of Rhode Island. I've also spoken here about 2 World War II in Rhode Island books. It's what happened here in Rhode Island, amazing things, including at Millville, where JFK trained. And my latest book is Dark Voyage. It's an American privateer from Providence goes to Africa to attack British slave trade interests there. All right, but let me talk about what I'm here for, which is Machine Guns in Narragansett Bay, my latest book, my first foray into this topic, but hopefully not my last. During World War II and World War I, normally people say during World War I and World War II, so I'll say that, Army and Navy fortifications ringed Narragansett Bay, and there was a lot of artillery. They had 18-inch guns, massive guns, and when they would fire in Narragansett or Little Compton, they would break windows all around. But none of these artillery pieces were ever fired in anger during the war. By contrast, from 1929 to 1933, during Prohibition, Coast Guard vessels in Narragansett Bay and other Rhode Island waters fired thousands of machine gun and 1-pound cannon rounds at fellow Americans. The intended targets were crew members on rum runners who, using speedy powerboats, had picked up illegal liquor from supply ships stationed at Rum Row, an area beyond the 12-mile zone off the southern coast of New England. Rum runners operating at night or in foggy conditions on their return voyages would cruise up any one of the 3 channels in Narragansett Bay to an assigned drop-off point to unload their liquor. Whoops. So here's a very fast, good picture of a very fast rum runner. Because buying and selling alcohol was illegal under Prohibition, if you had a successful voyage, you could make a ton of money. The Coast Guard became the lead federal government agency fighting the rum war at sea. Coast Guard patrol boats insisted on inspecting vessels suspected of carrying illicit liquor. And if the vessels didn't stop to be inspected, sometimes the Coast Guard opened up with large caliber weapons, machine guns or 1-pounder cannon. Sometimes extraordinary one-sided battles were witnessed by Rhode Islanders from the shore. For example, in October 1930, a veteran of World War I from his house in Watch Hill, probably pretty close to where, what's her name? Taylor Swift, where she has her house. So he told a Providence Journal reporter about the Coast Guard's attack on the rum runner Helen off Napatree Beach. I could see the flash of the 1-pounder, and I think the Coast Guard patrol boats must have fired it 50 times. Searchlights were flashing along the beach, and reports of the 1-pounder and the rat-tat-tat of machine guns sounded like a battle. I told my wife and daughter to get away from the window. Here's one of my favorite pictures of this period. The Helen, you can see is listing, that's the Helen. It had been fired at so many times by the 1-pounder cannon that it got a hole in its hull and started sinking. So the crew ran it ashore on Napatree Beach. They tried to escape. They were caught. Here's the next day. The federal agents are trying to remove sacks of liquor. Now, they had sacks of liquor. Originally, they would have crates, wooden crates, but they were too hard to carry. So it was much easier to have smaller sacks, which could be more easily carried. Sometimes they would have a hook on the top, and you could put it in the water and hook them out later. We'll talk about that in a minute. The Coast Guard was in a difficult position. It had the duty of enforcing laws at sea within the waters of the U.S., and it did not want lawbreakers to escape. Rich, can you maybe turn that down just a little bit? I don't know, is that a little loud, do you think? Or is it okay? It's good? All right, we'll stick with it. The Coast Guard didn't want lawbreakers to escape simply because they used speedboats. If the Coast Guard had been dealing primarily with those bringing in heroin or opium or some bad illegal drug, that would be one thing to fire guns at them. But this was prohibition. It was very unpopular not to be able to drink alcohol. It was very popular for the rum runners to bring them in from 1920 to 1933. Drinking alcohol was very popular among wide swaths of the population, especially in the Northeast, especially in New England, and especially in Rhode Island. Even many public officials assigned to enforce prohibition, governors, mayors, attorneys general, drank bootleg liquor. Moreover, Rich, if you just turn it down just a little bit, I'm getting some feedback and I'm trying to stand over here. Moreover, the crews on the rum runners typically were not hardened criminals. Many of them were former struggling fishermen, ordinary laborers, first and second generation immigrants, and otherwise good people who during the desperate years of the Great Depression saw rum running a little bit, not too much, but is that okay?
No.
You're not really picking, you got to turn, I just wanted it a little down, not too much.
Anyway, turn it away.
Okay. That sounds good. Maybe down a little bit. Drinking alcohol, moreover, crews and rum runners, again, were not typically hardened criminals, and that's an important point because sometimes the Coast Guard.
That sound is going that way instead of here. Turn it.
Yes, turn it this way.
Then I'll get feedback.
Well, and no, I think it's more the volume is more important than the placement. But okay, good. Again, a lot of the fishermen were struggling fishermen or rum runners, first and second generation immigrants, good people who during the Great Depression saw rum running as a chance to make a quick buck. Thus, having Coast Guard vessels fire their machine guns at rum runners became a controversial practice. I'm going to show you pictures of 4 rum runners. Do they look like hard criminals to you? Look at the first guy. You'd be very happy to have him over for dinner. He was the captain of the vessel. Second guy's a mechanic. Looks like a nice gentleman. Okay, these guys look a little more questionable. But the guy on the right comes from Wyoming, Rhode Island. They don't make hardened criminals in Wyoming, Rhode Island. So. My book examines, this is from the Whispering Wind, so the boat that's on the cover of my book. My book examines incidents in which Coast Guard vessels fired large caliber weapons, Lewis machine guns and Hotchkiss 1-pounder cannon, at and into fleeing rum runners in Narragansett Bay or in or near Rhode Island waters from 1929 to 1933. The source of the material I use is mostly the Coast Guard's own records in the National Archives and also contemporary newspaper articles, like the Newport Mercury. I use them a lot, and the Providence Journal. In the incidents covered in my book, three crew members on rum runners were killed by machine gun fire. One drowned after his boat was machine gun, caught fire and exploded. Another fell off his boat and drowned in mysterious circumstances after his boat had been shot at. 2 other shootings resulted in serious, life-threatening bullet wounds, and 8 more crew members received minor or moderate bullet wounds. I've come up with a total of 29 shooting incidents in which the Coast Guard fired large caliber guns at rum runners, striking the craft or in or near Rhode Island waters. In several incidents, hundreds of machine gun bullets were fired. It's a wonder that more men were not killed and wounded. One Coast Guard officer will be mentioned more than any others in these pages, or in my talk, Boatswain Alexander C. Cornell. While in command of patrol boat CG-290, Cornell ordered the firing of the machine gun at the fleeing Black Duck. How many of you heard of the Black Duck incident? Quite a few. That's the most of any crowd I've talked to, so you guys are very informed. While in command of patrol boat CG-290, Cornell ordered the firing of a machine gun at the fleeing Black Duck. That's what resulted in the killing of the 3 crew members. Cornell opened up his machine gun in Rhode Island waters on 5 other rum runners. And the incident involving the Yvette June and the Sakonnet River, machine gun bullets and 1-pounder shells fired by Cornell's patrol boat caused the Yvette June to explode. And that's when 1 crew member was killed. He wasn't even a crew member, he was just a friend along for the ride. Thus, one aggressive Coast Guard officer was responsible for most of the violent and deadly episodes in Narragansett Bay. Here's a picture of him on CG-290 in New London. New London was where Section Base 4 was located. That was the headquarters of the Coast Guard for southern New England. Still, his superiors in New London Section Base 4 appreciated what he did. They liked his tenacity. And other Coast Guard officers began to imitate Cornell. In one sense, the Coast Guard officers and crews ordered to enforce prohibition were not to blame. The Coast Guard was part of the Treasury Department, and the Treasury Department and the Coast Guard had policies authorizing Coast Guardsmen to employ large caliber weapons to shoot at fleeing vessels trying to avoid inspection. The intent was not to kill the crew members aboard rum runners, but when these strict law and order policies intersected with the wildly unpopular prohibition law and the demand for illicit liquor, accidents leading to tragedies inevitably occurred. On 3 occasions in Federal District Court in Providence, federal judges lambasted the Coast Guard for shooting at fleeing rum runners. For example, in March 1932, U.S. District Court Judge Ira Lloyd Letts, at the trial of the Rhode Island rum runner Eaglet, right off of the shore here, called the Coast Guard patrol boats firing 470 machine gun bullets in Narragansett Bay at the Eaglet, quote, a rather sad commentary on the administration of law in this country. My book also shows that the Coast Guard patrol boat commanders failed to follow the statutory law that you had to fire 1 blank shot before you can open up with machine gun bullets. And actually the Coast Guard's policy was you had to fire 3 blanks from the 1-pounder cannon before you could open up with live bullets. But often it wasn't complied with, and there was no real consequences for not doing so. Now, how did this situation happen where Narragansett Bay here became a virtual war zone on summer nights from 1929 to 1933? If you were living on the coast, a lot of times from Portsmouth and Middletown, you could hear these battles in Narragansett Bay. The story begins with the passage of prohibition in the United States by the enactment of the 18th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution in 1919. In Britain, Lord Curzon describes prohibition as Puritanism run mad, while Winston Churchill called it an affront to the history of mankind. He was always well lubricated when he visited the U.S., so no problems there. It has to be admitted, at the time leading up to the passage of the 18th Amendment, there was excessive drinking going on in this country. But the do-gooders addressed the problem with a sledgehammer. Rather than taking a more targeted approach, prohibitionists sought a total ban on the recreational use of alcohol. Temperance was also a way for the rural population of the United States, which was still significant at the start of the 1900s, to assert control over growing urban influence. Moreover, many conservative Protestant denominations, which carried considerable sway in the halls of the U.S. Congress, viewed drinking liquor as sinful and were deeply concerned about the influx of immigrants and hyphenated Americans, many of whom were Catholics. The drive forces were remarkably well organized and developed a powerful political lobby. The tipping point was World War I. After America declared war on Germany in April 1970, resentment against German-American beer makers and Irish-American drinkers, any of those here? Yeah, raise your hand, good. They ran high and they were viewed as favoring Germany. So these two important groups had to lay low during this dispute over prohibition. Dry activists pushed for a prohibition amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and in 1917, Congress voted in favor of the proposed 18th Amendment by heavy margins. 2/3 of the states are needed to pass any amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and on January 16, 1919, the 18th Amendment became law after the 36th state legislature in Nebraska ratified it, and the amendment was to take place 1 year later. This was one of only 2 amendments that restricted the ability of the freedom of Americans. Can anyone figure out what the other one was? No one's going to guess it. Not even you, Tim. But you should. You couldn't enslave anyone else. So you can't enslave anyone and you can't drink. Those were the 2 constitutional restrictions. The Rhode Island General Assembly never ratified the 18th Amendment, making Rhode Island one of 2 of the 48 states not to do so. Neighboring Connecticut was the other holdout, and this was not a coincidence since Rhode Island and Connecticut had the 2 highest percentages of Catholic population, 76% and 67% respectively. The Rhode Island State Senate vote was 20-18 to table the motion to adopt the amendment, and that pretty much killed the bill. Why was it that close? Because Rhode Island Senate, as it had been for more than a century, was absurdly dominated by rural towns of the state at the expense of Providence, Pawtucket, and other urban areas. Each Rhode Island town, regardless of its population, got 1 senator. So in 1925, rural towns with just 8% of the state's population held 22 of the 39 Senate seats. In this situation, the disproportionate power of rural voters in state legislatures across the country also helps explain why prohibition passed. No referendum was ever held in Rhode Island prior to 1920. There was in 1933. But if there had been, it likely would have lost resoundingly. The state had a high percentage of immigrants, 2nd and 3rd generation hyphenated Americans, and Catholics, groups that generally opposed prohibition. Something of a referendum was held in the Italian-American section in Providence, Federal Hill. In December 1918, there was a vote. Hey, do you guys want to authorize issuances of liquor licenses for stores? The referendum passed with 76% of the vote. Italian Americans wanted to continue their tradition of drinking wine with their meals. Still, prohibition was not without some support in Rhode Island. Anyone here might have supported it? Maybe? No? There's got 1 vote over here. Rural areas, many Protestant churchgoers, and some middle-class reformers in the state supported the 18th Amendment. They thought it'd be less crime, families of working-class people would be better treated. The state had a history of supporting local option laws and even had passed a state prohibition amendment in 1886, although that dry experiment was overturned 3 years later. And on the small state history website I have, if you look in the archives, you put in prohibition, you'll come up with that article in 1886. At the national level, Congress enacted a federal statute to implement the 18th Amendment and provide for its enforcement. The National Prohibition Act, better known as the Volstead Act, banned the importing, exporting, transporting, distributing, selling, and manufacturing intoxicating liquor. In the U.S., it had an alcohol content more than 0.05%. Now, it didn't say anything about possession. So before it became law, you could buy all the alcohol you want, put it in your basement and drink it. But, eventually it ran out. On January 17, 1920, the United States went dry, shutting down the country's 5th largest industry. In Rhode Island, the Narragansett Brewing Company had been founded by 6 German Americans in Cranston. By 1914, it had become the largest brewery in all of New England, but overnight their brewing facilities were rendered practically worthless, with no compensation from the federal government. From the beginning, the dry laws were flagrantly violated throughout the country. Bootleggers smuggled alcohol from Canada, stole it from government warehouses, that happened here in Rhode Island, or produced their own, that happened here in Rhode Island. Saloons were replaced by illegal speakeasies, which were hidden in basements or office buildings and typically admitted only those with membership cards. Here's some stolen, confiscated liquor. I also have an article that I did for Small State Big History on Izzy Einstein, the most famous federal prohibition agent of the day. And he was known for dressing in these obscure disguises and then getting into speakeasies and then arresting the owners and operators. In Rhode Island, they had only 5 prohibition agents, but they were all on the dole, so they weren't very effective. So what the Federal Prohibition Agency did was bring 12 up from New York City on a weekend to have a raid in Providence and Woonsocket and Central Falls. And Izzy Einstein dressed up like a bricklayer and knocked on the door in this office building in Westminster Street in Providence. And the guy opens up, little eye socket, and said, "What do you want?" "I need a drink." He said, "What's the password?" "I don't know the password. I just need a drink. I've been working all day." "Okay." Mistake. He got arrested. But Izzy said, after that weekend, he said Rhode Island was the wettest state he'd ever come across in the country. That's saying something. Rum runners in small boats cruised out to Rum Row to meet supply ships carrying foreign-made liquor. A lot of the liquor came from Scotland, whiskey, champagne from France, and Belgium, Germany. That's where the good quality stuff came from. This was viewed in some circles as performing a valuable service because the bootleg alcohol that was locally manufactured was poor quality, and sometimes it could be very bad for your health. Even if the rum runners product was sometimes watered down, at least it was made by professional distillers. Because of the quality of the bottles of whiskey and other liquor brought in by the rum boats was generally more expensive, so you couldn't drink it every night. Only the wealthy people could do that. Those looking to profit from continued demand for alcohol quickly came to the startling realization that Narragansett Bay, with its scores of coves and estuaries and inlets where small boats could be used to drop cargoes of illegal liquor at night, was a natural place for smuggling in alcohol. The smuggling operations that arose served not only drinkers in Rhode Island, but also those in Boston, the rest of New England, and even New York City. At one point, Al Capone visited Providence. Commercial fishing remained an important industry in Rhode Island and the rest of southeastern New England. With their small boat experience and skills, fishermen were ideal candidates to man the rum runners that were needed. They were highly motivated by the incredible earning potential from rum running. Before Prohibition, many commercial fishermen sometimes experienced difficulty just putting food on the table for their families, especially during the Great Depression. They were hardly the hardened criminals law enforcement sometimes tried to make rum runners out to be. Moreover, there's not one single incident where a rum runner fired a gun at a Coast Guardsman or even threatened to. So that's pretty significant. There were some gun battles in Providence, but those were bootleggers. Two of the most famous captains of rum runners in Rhode Island were Charlie Travers and Herbert Cavaca. Travers' parents were immigrants from the Azore Islands and only spoke Portuguese. There's a picture of Charlie Travers sitting down in a Newport hospital. He's being guarded by a Coast Guardsman. We'll talk about him later. By the way, my wife and I came back from the Azores. Loved it. Beautiful place to visit. The Hawaii of the East, it's done. Most of the Portuguese immigrants in this area of Fall River, New Bedford, 90% of them are from the Azores. And there's probably more of them than there are people in the Azores, where there definitely are. Herbert Cavaca was an Italian-American from Tiverton. Rhode Island soon earned a reputation as the wettest state in the country on a per capita basis. Yay! Let me get a drink. Water, excuse me. You guys didn't spike this, did you? I spoke at Finn's in East Greenwich, Finn's restaurant. And in the old days, they were in several rum runners that tied their boats up to fins. All right. Most of the ships hailed from the supply ships hailed from French-owned islands in Canada. Anyone know what islands they were? 2 islands, Nova Scotia. St. Pierre and Miquelon, that's right. And other ships came from Great Britain or Bermuda. Here's an old, early picture of a supply ship. Later on, they were more modern looking, but the first ones were sometimes, yachts and sailing vessels. St. Pierre and Miquelon were French, and they were kept by the French after the French and Indian War settlement in 1763. France said, hey, we want to have a place where our fishermen on the Grand Banks to go to, so they kept those islands. They're just small rocks, but during the Prohibition, millions of dollars of investments in warehouses. There were several rum rows on the Atlantic coast. The one off southeastern New England serving Rhode Island contacts boats and those of other southeastern New England ports, typically extended from the south of No Man's Land off of Martha's Vineyard and south of Black Island. So you can see No Man's Land right here and Black Island, south of that. The idea was if you wanted to go out, if you're in a contact boat, meet up with a supply ship and come back the same night. You didn't want to be seen, uploading or unloading the liquor on shore. For many in the early years of Prohibition, it was a source of national embarrassment that the Coast Guard had allowed the outside supply ships on Rum Row and their contact boats based on the mainland to operate virtually unfettered. The Coast Guard lacked adequate funding, vessels, and manpower to assume the additional mammoth task of enforcing U.S. customs and prohibition laws at sea. You had the East Coast, you had the West Coast, Gulf of Mexico, the Great Lakes, and where else in New England? Lake Champlain. In addition, many Coast Guard vessels were small and sturdy, designed to be at sea for long periods. They could only go about 10, 12 miles an hour. They were not designed to chase speedboats. Here's a poor rum runner. This was about 1920. They didn't have machine gun yet, so they had about 20 veterans from World War I with rifles. Matters began to change in 1924. Congress greatly increased the Coast Guard's budget, making it possible for the Coast Guard to build hundreds more ships and hire thousands of more Coast Guardsmen. The backbone of the Coast Guard fleet became the cutters, 75-foot patrol boats called 75s. They could patrol bays and go about 18 miles per hour. They carried a Hotchkiss 1-pounder at the bow and a Lewis machine gun on one of the aft sides. They were typically manned by 6 to 8 men. Here's a good picture of some 75s docked in Boston Harbor. I like this picture too because in the background there's a 5-masted sailing vessel. Smaller patrol boats ranging from 35 to 38 feet were called 36-footers, cabin picket boats, or just picket boats. They were equipped with 8-cylinder gas engines that could go even faster than the 75s, but they were more lightly armed. They just had the machine guns. They had a crew of 3 to 4 men. The Coast Guard had 2 wars to fight. The first was to challenge the rum ships, the supply ships, off the shoreline of New England, New Jersey, and southern New England. These rum ships would be stationed more than 12 miles offshore where the Coast Guard could not arrest them in general. The Coast Guard also confronted the contact vessels, that is, the rum runners that took loads of liquor from the supply ships and sped toward the shoreline to the landing zones of the rum runners in bays, coves, and inlets. There, burlap sacks of liquor would be unloaded onto a wharf or a beach. Then locally hired men would load waiting trucks with the liquor, or sometimes touring cars with hidden storage spaces were used. This was a good source of money for some of the local men. The rum running syndicate would then prefer to transport the liquor directly to wholesalers and retailers, but sometimes they couldn't do that, so they would store the liquor in barns. It is this second war at sea that is the topic of my book. By 1929, rum running syndicates in Rhode Island and the rest of southern New England were well organized. Their most important tool was the speedboat, which typically could outrun Coast Guard patrol boats. The speedboats often used powerful Liberty engines. And these were discarded engines from World War I airplanes. And there was a whole lot of them, and federal government would have these auctions, and rum runners would show up and buy one for $10. But speed was not the only factor. The speedboats also had to have a decent draft, so they wanted to carry 200 cases of liquor, 300, 400, 500. You can see them piled up on the decks of the ship as well. Here's a rare photograph of the Coast Guard chasing a rum runner. Interestingly, Crown and Shield Shipyard at Somerset, Massachusetts, and Knock Shipyard at East Greenwich received contracts to build Coast Guard patrol boats. Nice. They also received lots of contracts to build rum runners. And East Greenwich was a favorite place because they could, you dock at East Greenwich, and then if there was a couple of holes for a machine gun or the engine needed repair, you could just go right there, next door. The Coast Guard's new patrol boats could not keep up with the rum runners, the fast rum runners, so they made up for it with large caliber weapons. The Lewis machine gun was the deadliest. These guys are cleaning it. It was responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths in World War I. An American invented it, offered it to the American Army, but they didn't take it. Instead, the British Army took it. On Coast Guard patrol boats, it was typically mounted on the port side, and a top-mounted magazine pan usually held 47 rounds before it had to be reloaded. The other large caliber weapon 75s carried was a Hotchkiss 1-pounder gun. It was a small 37 millimeter cannon that shot a projectile that weighed 1 pound. It was a rapid fire gun. And it was used by the United States Navy mostly for saluting purposes, but it could be deadly. Here's a picture of that same picture of Boatswain Cornell. You can see the 1 pound cannon at the front there. And here's the machine gun, and it's possibly the same one that was used on the Black Duck. In 1925, a Coast Guard officer told a newspaper reporter about an incident that demonstrated the effective range of 1-pounders. Quote, recently an intermediary rum runner that was once the pleasure yacht of a well-known man was hailed off Block Island. It refused to stop. It was brought to anchor by a shell fired at it from a distance of 2.5 miles. The runner's captain lost a leg in the encounter, and several others were injured. 1,200 cases of liquor, 13 men, $2,000 in cash, and the boat itself were seized. This yacht sailed out of Newport and was a yacht formerly owned by a very wealthy Borden family member. One of my favorite rum running stories was this one syndicate had a boat as a yacht dressed, and they had the crew dressed up in nice white uniforms, so it looked like a yacht of a very wealthy guy. Couldn't possibly be a rum runner. Problem was the Coast Guard couldn't tell that at night, so they stopped the boat at night. This is another supply ship. You can actually see the bullet holes in the hull. This is called the Josephine, and on this one the captain was actually killed. Not in Rhode Island. While Coast Guard officials said that their boats had to fire live ammunition in order to stop faster speedboats that failed to stop and be inspected, that wasn't always the case. The rum runners, when they were loaded down with 300, 400, 500 cases, they couldn't possibly go as fast as they otherwise could. In addition, the Coast Guard could use multiple vessels to overhaul a rum runner. Sometimes they would have, two patrolling the front of the West Passage, and then they would have two behind it. So if one rum runner got by them, the two behind it could be signaled. Interestingly, a lot of the Coast Guard, they didn't have radios back then, 1929 to 1930s. So they would sometimes have to fire a flare. As mentioned, my book covers 29 incidents in which machine guns were fired at rum runners in Narragansett Bay and other Rhode Island waters. I only have time to discuss 2 of them today, and they're the first 2 in the book. The first incident started on the night of July 27, 1929, when boatswain Alexander Cornell spotted a low-lying speedboat on the Tiverton side of the Sakonnet River. And, incidents occurred in all 3 channels in Narragansett Bay. Cornell identified the speedboat as the Idle Hour, a rum runner that operated out of East Greenwich. Cornell had his patrol boat, CG-290, chase the speedboat, but Idle Hour sped north up the river. A rum runner's report later said that the machine guns from CG-290 struck the boat and a canvas tarp that the ship captain had put over his back. So because it was long distance, the bullets didn't penetrate the tarp. Idle Hour had a drop-off planned at Olney's Wharf in Tiverton, but instead it sped up the river and under the stone bridge. I think there's 11 feet. I think it's 11 feet or so around there. I have it in the book. And there was also the railroad bridge too that had to go under that too. Having escaped CG-290, it dropped its cargo of liquor in shallow water off Portsmouth and sped to East Greenwich. The crew never recovered the sacks of liquor. Normally they would have gone back the next morning. They have these little poles with a hook. You can hook it up to the hook on the bags, you get most of them. Didn't happen because the local residents of Portsmouth and Tiverton, using small boats, scooped it all up. Very clever. Perhaps some of your parents did that, so, or grandparents. Early in the morning, Cornell found the Idle Hour tied up at the wharf at East Greenwich. The crew had skedaddled, but the boat had bullet holes in it, and the engine was still warm. What made this incident extraordinary was that when William Freeman came to visit his home along the shore of the Secana River at Fogland Ferry, he found a table and chair in one of his rooms had been shattered, and he found a bullet lodged in the floor. He naturally arrived at the conclusion that the bullet must have been fired from the Coast Guard patrol boat CG-290 a few evenings before. After all, it is highly unusual for a bullet to enter a civilian's home from the river. I think we would all agree with that. Right? Freeman complained to U.S. Senator Jesse Metcalf, who then sent a letter of complaint to the head of the Coast Guard in Washington, D.C., Admiral Frederick Bullard. And here's the Admiral. Bullard had the Coast Guard investigate the matter, and perhaps not surprisingly, the investigation concluded that the bullet did not come from CG-290. Boatswain Cornell claimed that he never fired towards the Tiverton coastline, but Herbert Cavaca, who had organized the Idle Hour's voyage, later recalled that in Iran Rum, that CG-290 had fired machine gun bullets at some of his trucks on the Tiverton shore that had their headlights on, and he thought maybe the Coast Guard thought that was actually the rum runner. And in Cornell's official report, he even admitted firing his patrol boat's machine gun at Idle Hour as it turned toward the Tiverton shore. Even Admiral Bullard was skeptical of the conclusion in the Coast Guard's investigatory report, and he promised Senator Metcalf that Coast Guard patrol boats would not aim their machine guns toward the shoreline. But when Admiral Bullard instructed the head of the Coast Guard's base at New London to direct ship commanders not to fire machine guns if it could pose any risk to civilians on shore, the New London commander refused. He said that such a policy would allow rum runners to speed up the Secana River unfettered, as well as in portions of the West Passage of Narragansett Bay. Admiral Bullard also complained that boatswain Cornell had not fired blank warning shots from the 1-pounder at the Idle Hour. The New London commander again pushed back, saying that the rum runner's captain knew he was being pursued by a Coast Guard vessel and yet refused to stop and be searched. This all led to the next shooting incident, which would have national implications. The shooting of the Black Duck in the morning of December 29, 1929, was one of the most sensational incidents in all of Prohibition. The incident again involved boatswain Cornell, still in command of CG-290. Cornell tied up his patrol boat to buoy number 2, and that's an important fact. He tied it up, his boat, several hundred yards south of Bull Point in Jamestown in the East Passage, so south of the village. I took this picture of a buoy that is currently there, and this is a couple hundred yards from where the buoy number 2 was. I took this from Rum Runner 2 out of Newport, so I don't know, you guys, it's kind of fun to take. They didn't enjoy viewing me very much because they like to talk about Black Duck, but I corrected them on a few things. So. Cornell apparently, it's a lot of fun. Cornell apparently had information that the notorious rum runner Black Duck, after meeting up with the newly arrived supply ship at Rum Row, would be returning up Narragansett Bay with a large load of liquor on board. It was a few days before New Year's Eve, big party night. Cornell knew that Charlie Travers, Captain Black Duck. The two had crossed paths before, but each time Cornell stopped Travers was traveling light, meaning he didn't have any liquor on board. Black Duck was said to be the fastest rum runner operating in southeastern New England, able to reach a speed of more than 36 miles per hour. While tied to the buoy, Cornell and his crew heard the sounds of a motor. Through the dark and fog, Cornell could tell it was indeed the Black Duck, and it was heading his way. Cornell pointed his patrol boat's powerful searchlight on the rum runner and ordered crewman Lewis Pearson to man the Lewis machine gun on the boat's port side. Travers saw the looming Coast Guard patrol boat but kept speeding up north. As Black Duck passed the stern of CG-290, putting itself in between the patrol boat and the Jamestown coastline, Cornell yelled for the rum runner to heave to. Travers carried on. Cornell had to make a decision in seconds. His boat was tied to a buoy, so he had no time to start up his engines and chase the boat. He knew he was supposed to fire 3 blank warning shots using his 1-pounder, but by the time he did that, the Black Duck would have disappeared into the fog. Cornell ordered Pearson to open fire with a machine gun. "Let her have it," Cornell yelled. Not a very precise order, is it? Pearson let loose a pan of 27 bullets. Then his gun jammed. He worked frantically to unjam it. On board the Black Duck, 3 crewmen crouched in the pilot house while Travers had the wheel in the wheel room. Suddenly, machine gun bullets swept the deck. 3 crewmen were killed in the pilot house. 2 instantly, and 1 after a few seconds stumbled onto the deck. Travers received the bullet in his right wrist. Somehow Travers was able to turn his boat around, went back to CG-290, and he surrendered. Cornell jumped on board and saw the 3 dead crew members. He had the bodies laid out on the deck. He then ordered his crew to tow the Black Duck to the nearest medical facility, which was at Fort Adams. Travers was eventually taken to Newport Hospital and placed under guard. We saw the photo of him. Here's the official report of the shooting in the National Archives that I found. And here's a very prominent newspaper, St. Louis Globe-Democrat. Look at that headline. More than 100 newspapers had headlines the next day, and lots of stories later on. At the Seamen's Church Institute in Newport, the Reverend Roy Magoon called the killings downright murder. In Boston at Faneuil Hall, at a rally of anti-prohibitionists, afterwards some men rioted and tore apart Coast Guard recruiting stations. In New London, Cornell received a letter with a death threat, postmarked Patuxent, Rhode Island, and local toughs beat up Coast Guardsmen. The toughs found this Coast Guardsman and said, "Hey, were you guys members of the Black Duck crew? Were you a member of the Black Duck crew?" "No, but I am with the Coast Guard." "Well, that's good enough for us." And gave the old 1-2. These are rare pictures of the Black Duck stationed at Patuxent while the investigation is going on, Patuxent Cove. Here's a rear view, and you can see if you were close up, you could actually see some machine gun holes in the dory. In Congress, Representative Fiorella LaGuardia spent 40 minutes complaining how Prohibition had tarnished the Coast Guard. The New York Herald Tribune wrote, "It may be that bloodshed is inevitable in the enforcement of a law that large sections of the country treat with contempt. But does this excuse the raking of an unarmed rum runner at close range with machine gun fire?" But prohibitionists supporters had their views too. An editorial in the Washington Post stated, "The rum runners got only what was coming to them. When smugglers are on the open water, it is not only the duty of the Coast Guard to pursue and search them, but to kill them if there's no other means of overhauling them." Wow. I don't think the Washington Post would say that today. In Rhode Island, the state's attorney general's office convened a grand jury to decide if Cornell and his crew should be tried for murder or manslaughter. The jury, after 11 days, decided that the charges should be dropped. It was the right decision. The shooting was not intentional, and it was the policy of the Treasury Department to have Coast Guard vessels shoot at rum runners that refused to stop when warned. The shooting was a tragic accident, but it was an accident bound to happen at some point when the Coast Guard fired machine guns near rum runners or even at their sterns, trying to disable them. Here's 2 bullets I found in the file, the investigation file at the archives. The machine gunner Pearson claimed he was just firing warning shots, but he made 2 fatal mistakes. First, he apparently aimed at the stern of the Black Duck in order to disable it, not behind it. And second, while he claimed to give a warning shot by shooting into the air, he shot his machine gun at deck level. Mistakes happen. Cornell and his crew claimed that the Black Duck had veered to the left just as the machine gun fire started, thus moving into the path of the bullets. The Coast Guard investigation adopted this explanation, but it was not accurate. The Coast Guard's own drawing showed that the path of the bullets came from the stern of the boat and not on its port side. So here's one map from the investigation. You can see the left turn up there. But this is the map of where the bullets came from. All the bullets came from the stern. Travers, in turn, made a fatal mistake in addition to not heaving to. Most rum runners piled sacks of liquor behind the wheelhouse. This acted as a protection against bullets. Here's the Whispering Wind. You can see how it was all piled up. But whether that would have worked at such close range in the Black Duck's case is not known. Let's look at the owner of the Black Duck and its crew. The owner was Joe Dressler of West Warwick. His Jewish parents had fled persecution and poverty in Eastern Europe, and his family had started a meat rendering business in Pawtucket. The Dresslers were not particularly wealthy. One of the crew members was Jake Wiseman. He was the son-in-law of Joe Dressler. He was also Jewish. As mentioned, Charlie Travers, the captain, his parents immigrated from the Azores and didn't speak English. The same was true for a third crew member, John Goulart. The Goulart and Travers families were neighbors and friends in Fairhaven, Massachusetts. Goulart and Travers were fishermen by trade. The fourth crew member was Dudley Brandt. He was married with children, lived just outside Boston. He was known as an excellent boat mechanic. In short, these men were not hardened criminals who deserved to have machine guns fired at them. Now, while the shooting of the Black Duck was the most famous shooting incident mentioned in my book, it's just one of 29 total shootings that occurred in Rhode Island waters. I'm going to go through a few images now. I found this in the files. Machine gun fire, all concentrated into the area bounded by the red rectangle on both quarters in order to disable machinery or to explode gas tanks. Wow. When you explode a gas tank, people are going to die. This is a very rare picture of the second most famous rum runner in Rhode Island waters, the Mauna Lola. It had 3 very exciting chases in Narragansett Bay. On one of them, the U.S. Navy had about 12 ships stationed in the bay, and the rum runner was weaving in between them all so that the Coast Guard wouldn't fire at it. Here's a famous one called the Nola. Some of the crew members got tired of being fired at, so they steel-plated this rum runner. The idea was that a guy out of New Bedford and Martha's Vineyard. It was crossing from Martha's Vineyard, headed towards the Connet River, but it was caught by 2 Coast Guard boats. It did a good job deflecting machine gun bullets, but another Coast Guard vessel got up right next to it, pointed its 1-pounder cannon. It was like a War of 1812 battle, except only one side was shooting. And eventually it surrendered. And again, a destroyer came along and towed the boat to London, but it sank along the way. So maybe divers will find that someday. And lastly, this is the rum runner High Strung. It was caught and brought to the Custom House in Providence. Well, that ends my presentation. Thank you. I'll be glad to take any questions.
Yeah, was there any connection between
Well, the rum runners, is there any comparison? Did the design of the rum runners kind of lead to the PT boats? Definitely a lot in common, especially with the one before. It was steel plated. That's basically what PT boats were. They were made of plywood, and you just slap some iron on them. I think so, because they just, they developed the engines, very powerful engines, to be streamlined. I would think so. The PT boats also had to carry weapons, so they had to be a little heavier. So.
Is there any evidence of them using the train to transport it after it hit the land?
Train?
Yeah.
Were any evidence of using a train? I did come across one time. Yeah, it was. Yeah, that's right. Well, I think it was it was actually in Quidnick Island. They were near Newport, I think. So it must have been the old colony line. Yeah, I think that might have been what Al Capone was trying to do. So. Not sure it ever came off though.
I'm surprised that the rum runners didn't fight back.
Yeah, why didn't they fight back? The penalties were not that harsh for rum runners. After the third time, you might go to jail. Oh, wow, go to jail for 6 months or something. And so, but if you fired at them and hurt somebody, that would be serious. You could be put in jail for a lot longer. So I guess that was it. I mean, they were outmanned with a machine gun. They couldn't deal with a machine gun.
Come across a rum runner who used to run out of Fall River, one of the most notorious.
Oh yeah, many out of Fall River. Yeah, there were many. I focused mostly on Rhode Island, of course, because you guys want to hear Rhode Island, right? So.
This guy used to run up to Secana.
Yeah, a lot of them did. Yeah.
Unload in Little Compton.
What was the name?
I forget.
Not helpful. It's probably in my book. They're probably one of them in the book. So, Je t'aime, maybe? No, that was East Greenwich. But yeah, I mean, the whole area, they didn't really differentiate between Narragansett Bay and Westport was a big area as well.
But there's a friend that grew up in Fall River, a guy named Charlie Soares, who's a great fisherman.
Ah,
And he tells me at the time he saw that rum runner cut a boat in half like it was nothing.
really? Wow. Sounds exciting.
I'll get the name.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Do you have any statistics on what percentage of alcohol was actually stopped by the federal government?
What percentage of alcohol was stopped? I mean, Herbert Kavaka would say, very low. The Coast Guard got better as the years came on, and eventually most of the rum runners got caught, and the black duck was caught, and then they passed a law that said that a lot of what would happen was, the eaglet, the one that had 470 bullets fired at it, it was forced to be sold at auction, but the main guys showing up at auction were the former owners, and they warned anybody, you better not buy that boat, you know what'll happen. And so they would buy it back for cheap. Then the federal government changed the law and said, well, the Coast Guard had the first rights to buy the boat. So they bought the black duck and they turned it into a rum running vessel that went after rum runners. And same with Whispering Winds, beautiful boat, very fast. And that was also converted into chasing rum runners. So they did better at the end, but in the early years they were not effective at all. Yeah.
Yeah, but the impact of the black duck was enormous, as Christian has said. The fact that all of a sudden the Coast Guard is killing people made all the newspapers, and people began to say, is it really worth it? And not long after that, we got a president, Roosevelt, who liked his martini every afternoon. And eventually in his administration, as his administration began, they began to change the laws on prohibition. But it really was, black duck was really crucially important in convincing people that this was just really stupid. They
Yeah.
keep killing people for that.
Yeah, I agree. It really helped change people's mindsets. But it still took, prohibition didn't end until 1933.
Yeah.
Interesting that Roosevelt, he did not campaign saying, I'm going to end prohibition. Everyone knew he was going to do it, but he didn't want to alienate, all the supporters. There were still a lot of female voters, for example. Some of them were the first time early voters, and a number of those supported prohibition. But he did end it when he.
It may have been prohibition, but how profitable was this business that people could be killing each other and the Coast Guard after them just because it was illegal?
It was extremely profitable. I mean, fishermen hardly made any money. They could make 3 or 4 months' wages just going on one trip, you know. And for the captain, you know, ton of money. Problem is, they had to spend money too. The rum runner from Tiverton, he tried to use a submarine, so he bought a submarine. That didn't work out. He bought an airplane. That was illegal, but that didn't, you know, couldn't fly them at night. He had hired a radio operator, which was illegal as well. So he had a lot of expenses. And then if you get caught, you know, one ship is caught, one huge shipment is caught, that can really hurt too. But you know, some of these numbers being thrown around, a load caught was $25,000, $40,000, $60,000, and this is 1930 money. You know, so it's probably, you know, I don't know, 5 times, 10 times today.
Just a comment, I enjoyed your last article on the email article, which mentioned how much money these guys made, but I hadn't realized, I thought it was very interesting that the carrier vessels that were bringing the booze had flags saying, you know, Doers or Jamesons or whatever out there, so the runner boats would know which ones to go to, what they want.
Well, most of the supply ships had contacts on the shore, so they were prearranged times. The supply vessels might go off 15 miles offshore, but at the right time they would come just inside 12 miles at a specific point. But yeah, occasionally you know, if you're a contact vessel, you could go shopping, like you said. Yeah.
Since there's water on both sides of Aquidneck Island, how many people were involved that were locals on the island that did this at night?
A good number. I think most of them actually came from Little Compton and Tiverton. That's where most of the action was. But Jamestown a little bit, Charlestown a little bit. So Warwick Neck, there was quite a bit going on there. The Crime Castle, Carl Reddick, Nelson Aldrich's house apparently had a tunnel that led right to the house.
I know where there are 2 of those off of Water Street.
Water Street in East Greenwich or Warwick? Here?
Portsmouth,
Oh, really? Wow.
up the top end.
Yeah. I'm aware of one big haul where the federal agents actually caught one guy on Second Beach. Somebody probably turned him in. So these guys all turned each other in too. Because one problem was one wealthy syndicate would pay bribes to the police. They said, "Well, I don't want this other guy taking advantage of my bribes that I'm paying." So they would squeal on the other guys when they had a shipment coming in. So.
You speak of the black duck, and some of my relatives were very fascinated with the fact that it was so fast. And it's because of the need for more speed. Boat engineering developed quite a bit, they would say.
Yes,
at that
yes,
time.
yeah. There was a very fast, I mentioned in my book, this guy set a speed record, Garwood and Detroit, and so they were all over that. I think it was with Packard engines. So suddenly these rum runners had 3 Packard engines in their boats, you know. So
Black Duck had twin 350 horsepower.
twin 350 horse. And you could see it wasn't really streamlined. It looked a little small, but it could
Charlie
move.
Lindbergh worked on them in the 20s for the rum runners.
Couple more.
My neighbor was with the boy someplace around the First World War period, was walking down Bristol Ferry Road, headed towards the landing, which would be under the Monroe Bridge today. And there was going to be a landing of some runners, I guess. And he was told, don't go any farther. No, don't go right now. Let's go home.
Yeah, you don't want to.
There were fields in Portsmouth full of mash that had been, alcohol had been made from, just out in the middle of a field somewhere, some farmer's field, there'd be this big pile of stuff.
So that's bootlegging, you know, that's not bringing it in from the sea, but a lot of bootlegging was going on
That's
too.
here a lot.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. One more up here?
Well, there, I know on the west coast, there were boats that were beyond the legal mile limit and no one could touch them and people would take boats out and go drinking out on them. Was there any such thing here on this coast?
Good question. I'm not sure. You know, so people for pleasure they would go out, and I haven't heard of that. I did. You know, the cruise ships had an interesting issue because they could. You know, they got a lot of business, so they would go out and they would have drinking. You could do all the drinking you want beyond 12 miles, but then they got some blowback, so they had to cut that back a little bit. But,
I know outside of Los Angeles, in Santa Monica, in that bay, they would have boats out there and you could gamble and you could drink.
mm,
And people would take these little boats out, you
Yeah,
know, and
yeah.
just go and no one could touch them.
mm,
So I just wondered.
yeah, interesting.
The noble experiment.
The noble experiment. Yes, yes.